As Gemini and Layton strive to overcome the shadows of their past and start anew, does an unexpected pregnancy bring hope or panic? How will they welcome the arrival of this new life while ensuring their family is no longer threatened? Join our pack. Subscribe to start your adventure. Chapter 26. I don't understand. I shook my head in confusion. Why would my mother do this to me? I told you, Gemini, Thomas is a very manipulative man. He got inside your mother's head and made her think what she was doing was going to save you. Layton reminded me. He pressed a soft kiss to the top of my head. Whether you see it or not, she did it because she loves you. In a very twisted, fucked up way. A week had passed since my mother had disappeared, and I vowed never to see her again. I wanted to forget about her, erase what she did from my memories. Because no matter how many reasons there were, no matter how many times it was explained to me that she didn't do it out of malice, she had still murdered my child. I would never forgive her for that. I lay in bed with Layton, my head resting on his chest, as his fingers knotted themselves in my hair. The morning sun was streaming through the windows, giving the bedroom an odd orange tint. Can I ask you something? I blurted. You can ask me anything. You know that, Layton replied, his attention still very much on the way his fingers threaded through my blonde curls. After our pup died, why did you hate me? The question made Layton pull his fingers away and sigh heavily. That is such a childish thing to say. Of course I didn't hate you. My feelings for you didn't change, but my feelings for myself changed. What does that mean? I asked, turning so that I was looking into his large green eyes. I know that it was my fault that our pup was killed. I tried making the perfect life for you, because that's exactly what you deserve. But I fucked up and I ruined your innocence. I felt guilty for being the one who killed your pup, for being the one who took your naivety away, and for marrying you in the way I did. You regret marrying me. I squealed, sitting up and allowing the covers to fall away from me. Gemini, calm down. I don't regret meeting you or marrying you or falling for you. I just wish I hadn't have pushed it so much. Maybe then you'd be happier. I was feeling guilty after the pup died because I realized that if I hadn't pressured you for children, then none of this would have happened. Layton ran a hand down his face, groaning softly as he sat up next to me. If I was given a choice, Layton, I wouldn't change our time together. Every bad bit, every good bit, it brought us to here, so please don't think like that. We're together because we love each other. Don't make it sound like you forced me to love you, because I did that all by myself. Once Layton had gone to work, I went down into his study and got his work phone. I called Valentine. He answered after a few moments. Alpha Ascenda speaking, he chirped. Valentine, it's Gemini, I replied. I hadn't talked to Valentine since I left his pack, after my miscarriage. Gemini, how are you? How have you been? He asked instantly. I told him the truth and we spoke a little bit about mundane topics before we got to the real subject. Gemini, as much as I love chatting to you, and I really do, you know that I happen to have a job to do. And I also happen to know that you didn't call to chat about how Evan is getting on at med school. He laughed. I could imagine his sly, amused smirk on his beautifully sculptured face. If Layton challenges Thomas and it goes ugly, will you stand with us? I questioned. I was nervous that Layton would try and battle Thomas, and I didn't want to lose him or anyone in the pack. You're both family, of course I will stand by you. I hope it doesn't come to that, but if it does, you can count on me. I could hear the soft frown in his words. Like me, he didn't want Layton to battle. But like me, he knew that Layton did whatever Layton wanted. Thank you, Valentine. Send my best to Evan. We said our goodbyes before I hung up. It was nice to speak to Valentine. I felt like he understood me. He was right. We were family and I missed him. Although, I was much happier to be home with Layton where I belonged. Another month went by smoothly, Layton and I falling into our old routines. I even began to redo the attic again like I had started before the first murder. It seemed so long ago since that human had died, but it had only been a handful of months. But that was when the entire nightmare had started, all the way back then. It also came to light that one of Layton's stronger pack wolves, a man named Joseph, had been the one passing information to Thomas. He was the traitor who helped Thomas kill those human girls. Joseph was Andrea's brother, and had been angry with the way his twin had been treated by Layton. Both Layton, Anthony and I strongly suspected Andrea was also involved, but we didn't have the evidence to execute her like her twin brother. Yet, Layton and I knew the threats that faced us, but we were living in a joyful ignorance, living as if nothing was wrong. I had gotten into the habit of speaking to Valentine on Wednesday mornings, mundane things, nothing heavy. I was also beginning to come to terms with the miscarriage. My child had died and I needed to deal with that. It was only as the month was coming to an end that the vengeful Alpha made connect with us. It was early morning Wednesday, and I headed downstairs in my pajamas and robe. I heard the phone ringing from Layton's study. Assuming it was Valentine, I headed in and answered the phone. "Hello," I chirped. "Ah, little Miss Gemini," I presume a deep husky male voice chuckled through the receiver. I froze in slight shock. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking slightly. I slipped my hand into my pocket and pulled my phone out as I spoke. I dialed Layton's number. "You mean you don't know who I am?" The voice laughed just as Layton picked up. I put both phones on speaker. "But I left you a lovely present," the man continued. "All those bodies just for you. And of course I sent your mother to you with my regards." "Shame didn't she pass the message on?" "Alpha Roberts," I replied through gritted teeth. And I heard Layton growl on the other end of his phone. "Please call me Thomas." "Gemini, honestly, aren't we familiar enough by now to call each other by our first names?" "You killed my pup," I snapped. I was trying to sound brave, even though my entire body was shaking with fear. "Technically, your own mother killed your pup. I simply suggested the idea." "What do you want, Thomas?" I questioned, genuinely interested. He had been playing the cat and mouse game with us for months, but neither Layton nor I actually knew what he wanted, what his endgame was. "I want Layton to suffer like I did," Thomas shouted. For the first time I heard the angry, bitter man that Layton had described to me. "He killed my mate, my Lorraine, and now I want him to suffer like I did when she died." "He's already suffered. You killed his pup. And it's not enough," he screamed angrily. "I want to meet you, me and Layton. Tomorrow evening, Chable's territory. And we'll sort this out once and for all. 7 o'clock, don't be late." And with that he hung up. When Layton got home he was fuming. His face a darkening red, as his clenched jaw tightened, and his entire body looked like it had been injected with tension. He was furious. At first I was worried it was at me. But I knew that I was being ridiculous. "Why did you answer the phone in my office to begin with?" Layton demanded, frowning down at me. He was doing the thing I hated, trying to get me to answer by showing his status. It wasn't a conscious thing by Layton. He did it out of pure habit. But it had always bugged me. I stepped away and walked around so that I was on the other side of the kitchen counter. I began to make us both a cup of coffee to justify the move away. I answered the phone because I thought it was Valentine. "You know we call each other on Wednesdays," I replied as I got the milk out. I knew how Layton worked. If I pretended to be busy and continued to do mundane things, he didn't get as angry. If I were to sit down quietly and shrink against his intimidation, then he would focus entirely on the bad parts of the situation. However, if I was doing something, he would focus slightly on that and it would distract him. He was like a child in that way. I was making coffee for the sole purpose of calming him, and it worked well. Layton sighed heavily, taking a seat at the kitchen island. "I didn't mean to accuse you of anything. You know what I get like," he muttered, frowning deeply as he thought hard. I walked around to his side and placed a cup of steaming coffee in front of him. Leaning into his space, I traced the frown lines on his forehead. The touch made him come out of his thoughts and look at me. "You shouldn't frown so much, it'll make your wrinkles worse when you get older," I told him. Layton let out a soft noise that slightly resembled a sigh and a laugh. "Well, some of us are closer to 30 than 20, he replied. "You're 25, Layton, don't be riding your wool just yet," I smiled. I was standing up beside him, so I took the seat next to him, moving it first so that I was closer to Layton. He offered me a soft smile before placing his hand on my thigh. "I've already written my will," Layton shrugged, and I raised an eyebrow in shock. "You get everything, you and any pups we have. You're my wife, you'll just be getting what is rightfully yours." "This is depressing," I frowned, taking a sip of my own coffee, as Layton picked his up and cupped it in his large hand, as his other hand continued to caress my upper leg. "I don't want to imagine living without you. Please let us talk about something else." "We can't. Tomorrow night we'll be meeting Thomas, and no doubt he'll try and kill me. So this exactly what we should be taking about," he replied, giving my thigh a soft squeeze. "We're actually going." I squealed in shock. He gave my thigh another squeeze before nodding stiffly. "Yes. I refuse to let someone who wants to hurt you to be alive. Anyone that even so much thinks of hurting you, I am going to kill. So we'll go, and then Antony will bring you back, while I make sure then Thomas is dead. Chapter 27. Layton, Antony, Valentine and I all climbed into my husband's car. After the telephone conversation with Thomas, Layton had called his cousin, who had immediately flown over to our territory. I was glad to have Valentine's support. Thomas wanted us to meet him in Chable's territory. I didn't know where that was, but Layton did. The Chable's pack was a small wolf pack about 2 hours away. The old alpha had upset Layton a few years back and he had killed him. After that, the pack wolves had fled to other packs, leaving the territory completely unclaimed. The drive was silent, thick with tension. Layton and Valentine were sat in the front, both of them rigid and stiff. It was an odd sight, seeing them like that, Valentine like a blonde angel and Layton like a dark devil. They were such opposites, it was almost humorous. No matter how many times I saw the cousins together, I was still shocked that they were so different. Antony and I sat awkwardly in the back, both of us staring out the window. Occasionally we would glance at one another, and he would give me a small smile trying to calm me down. I was grateful because I knew he wasn't exactly the most sympathetic of people, but he knew how scary the situation was for me. I felt completely out of my comfort zone in every way. Layton and the others were used to fighting and killing and violence. But not me. I was used to a quiet life, staying at home and being a quiet housewife. That was what I was used to, staying at home and looking after the aftermath of situations. I was a home commitment solider, not one who went on front lines. Layton only took me along as he was trying to demonstrate how he wanted me more involved in the pack, and he wanted to try and give me more responsibilities. "We're here," Layton grumbled as he slowed the car. I sat up straighter and looked out the window. The ground was muddy and uneven, a small dirt track in the middle of an overgrown forest. The vegetation was spreading rapidly out in all directions, giving the area an enchanted look. It was dark, the sun being blocked out by the thick trees. We drove for a few minutes, all of us gripping the sides as the car threw us around a bit. Layton didn't apologize for the bumpy journey. When we got further into the heart of Chable's pack, I gulped deeply. There was abandoned houses and shops, all with broken windows and doors that were hanging off their hinges. The entire place looked like a ghost town, with only the sound of the car's tires crunching the dry leaves filling the silence. I swallowed deeply. The place sent shivers over my spine. When Layton pulled the car to a stop and everyone got out, I paused slightly. Layton didn't notice and began to look over the area. Valentine noticed and opened my car door. Without a word, he held a hand out to me and helped me out. He didn't drop my hand as we stood outside, a soft breeze blowing over us and making a few of the hanging doors creak. I was shaking, not out of coldness but out of fear, but Antony glanced in my direction and draped his coat over my shoulders anyway. After Layton had finished looking over the area, he returned to the car. "No sign of him yet," he said. He glanced at where my hand was in Valentine, and where Antony's coat covered my shoulders. Frowning deeply, Layton pulled the jacket off me and threw it back to his beta. He then helped me put his coat on, rolling the sleeves up for me, before he glared at his cousin and took to holding my hand himself. I didn't comment on his possessiveness, because it was a small comfort in my discomfort state. "I'm scared, Layton," I whispered a few minutes later. Valentine and Antony had gone to look over the area again, trying to find anything that remotely linked to the revengeful alpha who was on his way. "I know you are, but I won't let anything happen to you," he replied. He looked down at me, cupping my cheek. We stared at each other for a while, neither of us saying anything, just simply taking in the sight of one another. I knew what Layton looked like. I couldn't forget such a handsome face, but as I stared at him, I made sure to study the other things about him. The small lines on his forehead, the small freckle by his left eye, the way his left eyebrow was the tiniest bit higher than his right, the way his sideburns blended into his stubble. He really was beautiful, and I kept drinking him in. Layton was the one to break the silence. "From the first day I saw you, I think I knew how I felt about you. I couldn't help but be bewitched by your looks, amused by your innocence and shocked by your kindness. As soon as I saw you, I knew that I had to have you." "Layton, No," he cut me off, pushing his finger over my lips. "Just let me say this. Nothing is going to happen to me, but just in case something does, I need to say these things now." His eyes showed emotion. which made me nod. He only conveyed his emotions in times of real significance. That day, at the mating ritual, I went there not planning to take a mate. I wanted a pup, but I didn't want a mate. Yet, when you knocked into me, everything seemed to change. I saw this beautiful blonde-haired, gray-eyed little wolf. Yes, she was weak and shy, but she made me feel something I'd never felt before. You made my heart race and my hands sweat. And I knew just from looking at you that there was something different about you. It was your beauty and your lack of desire that drew me to you. But it was something else altogether that made me actually choose you. There was a heavy pause, Layton looking at me as another soft breeze whipped around us. I never meant to turn out like this, Gemini. I never meant to become like I am, but shit happens. And seeing you, I remembered something. When I was a child, there was this girl in my pack. She was a year younger than me, and she looked a lot like you. She had these large blue eyes and this beautiful blonde hair. I must have only been 6, but we would play together because my parents were friends with hers. I used to really like her. She was like my childhood best friend, yet I still can't remember her actual name. Anyway, when I grew up, I began to hate this girl. Because every time I thought of her, I thought of my childhood. So I began to hate what she represented because she was so happy and I couldn't be like that because of my mother. So I grew to despise that blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl. You look a lot like her, and usually when I see girls who look similar, I hated them too. Yet, when I saw you, I didn't hate you. No, I felt something different. It was like you were this mass force that just blew your way into my life and took over everything. Which was absurd because you were so scared of me that you wouldn't even look at me. Layton, I interrupted, my voice was shaking. I hadn't even realized I was crying, and neither did Layton. He offered me a sad smile before wiping my cheeks. Why do you sound like you're saying goodbye? I'm not saying goodbye, I'm saying hello, he replied, giving me a tight smile. I have kept so much from you, and protected you too much that I have ended up putting you in danger. I just want to make it clear that once Thomas is dead, we're going to start afresh. No more plan, no more. But you said that your plan was to make everything perfect. You're already perfect, so nothing you do could ever be wrong, he stated. I smiled through my tears before getting on my tiptoes and pressing a kiss to my lips. I love you, I told him. Ditto, Layton nodded, which made us both laugh like it always did. We kissed once more, before I just rested on his broad chest. I could hear his steady, strong heartbeat as I slipped my arms around him. I felt like a scared child, gripping onto their father, but I was scared and Layton was my rock. Anthony joined us a few seconds later. What are you two girls gossiping about? At his words, Layton glared at him. Hey, I thought you were trying to be nicer and fairer. Not to people who insinuate I am of a different gender. Anthony laughed, alright. But while we're on this note, maybe you should stop referring to the she-wolves as bitches in the future. Just in the interest of being nicer. His lips were smirking, he was teasing Layton, but Layton didn't realize. Bitches mean female dogs, he stated, confused. Well, yes, and she-wolves are female dogs. Ergo, they are bitches. My grandfather taught me everything I know about she-wolves, and he called them bitches. And back in his day, bitches wasn't an insult. But it's just a very old-fashioned speech, Alpha, and I think female wolves are bitches. Your argument is null. Layton waved his hand dismissively. If I can run my pack even slightly like he did, then I'll be a great leader. I giggled slightly as Anthony rolled his eyes. Layton may have admitted he was a bit strict, but he would never admit he was wrong. It was useless trying to convince him otherwise. Layton, he's here, Valentine shouted, making us pulling away and sober up. We turned to see Valentine jogging towards us, his blonde curls bouncing as he did so. Anthony was close behind him. At his words, my fear rocketed. Layton noticed and helped me to him tighter. Stay close to me, Layton whispered into my hair, pressing a soft kiss to my head. Valentine moved to my left side, and I wanted to grab him as well, but I didn't want Layton any more upset than he already was. Anthony stood on the right side of Layton and I. Thomas arrived a few minutes later. He drove in, parking about 100 yards away. There was a heavy moment as we all stared at the car. Before the door opened and Thomas got out, Alpha Roberts was not what I expected. Before us stood an elderly man, in his late 50s to early 60s, with a head of silvery gray hair. His skin was littered with wrinkles and creased lines showing the life he had already lived. There was a heavy moment as we all looked at him. Who the hell is that? Layton finally snapped. Where the hell is Thomas? It was then I realized that the elderly man wasn't Alpha Roberts, and that something odd was going on. I gulped my fear, making my hands shake. I gripped a hold of Layton's shirt, my fingers almost tearing through the fabric. Layton growled softly, before forcefully pushing me into Anthony. I fell into his beta's arms as he stalked away. Anthony held me tightly, and I quickly cuddled into him, terrified. Layton stalked over to the old man. "Who the hell are you? And where the hell is Thomas?" he screamed. I knew that his rage was down to one thing: he was nervous. He would never admit it, but Layton was nervous about what Thomas had planned. And when Layton was nervous, he turned all his emotion into blinding rage. The old man didn't reply, and there was a moment before I heard a crunch to our left. I span on my heel, as did Anthony and Valentine. "Layton, it's a distraction," someone shouted. I wasn't sure if it was me who shouted, or someone else, but we had all realized it. There was a split second as I saw who I assumed to be Thomas. He was fairly short for a man with a large, broad build. He was stocky, with muscles that seemed to make him look almost like a pumped-up doll. His hair was a chestnut red, and his skin a pale color. For the briefest of seconds, Alpha Roberts and I met eyes. Then the man raised a gun in my direction and shot. Before I could think of anything, I was shoved out the way. I fell to the floor clumsily, just as the discharged bullet hit the body of its victim. I screamed as blood splattered me. Chapter 28. Everything went in slow motion: the fall, the shot, the blood splatter, and the scream. Valentine had seen the gun before me, and he had dived to the floor, grabbing me as he went. The both of us fell, our sides hitting the hard, uneven ground as the gunshot ran out. I heard Layton shout a large no behind me as he ran towards us. Valentine groaned in pain from the fall as I screamed out. Anthony paused before he looked down at his gut. The bullet had been aimed for my chest, but he was taller than me. The bullet had hit his mid-stomach. "No," I screamed as I jumped up and ran to his. "Gemini, get down," Layton screamed, before I saw him in front of me. One moment Layton was running towards me, the next he dived at Thomas. I didn't look, but I could hear them fighting. I was too busy looking at Anthony. "No," I cried as I grabbed a hold of him. But I was too weak to hold him up, as we both fell down together. I slumped on the floor awkwardly, as he landed on top of me. I was crying, Layton was fighting, Valentine was shouting, and Anthony was dying. I wrapped my hands around him, pressing them onto the wound. Scarlet blood covered my pale fingers, and I let out a heavy sob. "It hurts," Anthony choked, struggling to breathe through the pain. "Just hold on, please, we'll get you to a hospital," I willed. Hands shaking as I tried to press down harder, stopping the blood rushing out. It didn't help any, there was too much blood. "Layton, help," I shrieked. I didn't get a response, so looked away from him and up to where Layton was. He had Thomas in a choke hold, his large hands around Thomas's neck. There was a heavy pause before Layton snapped his hands to the left, breaking his enemy's neck instantly. Thomas's body collapsed to the floor. Dead. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't react. I was too sad about Anthony to even care that Thomas was dead. Valentine was also shouting. I glanced over to see him trying to get the old man to leave. Layton noticed that too and wasn't happy. He sprinted over, before killing the old man the same way he had Thomas. It was obvious Layton was angry, but I didn't mind. I too was angry. I turned back to Anthony, who I realized had gone limp in my arms. His eyes were closed, and his breathing had silenced. "Anthony," I said, shaking him slightly. He didn't reply, and his head lopped to the side. "No, Anthony, no." I raised my blood-soaked hand to his neck, and felt for a pulse. There wasn't one. "No, you can't be." I pushed him off my body, and lay him flat on the ground. Sobbing hard, covered in blood, I began to preform CPR, my hands pushing on his chest as I cried. After 4 presses, I sealed my mouth over his and pushed my breath into his lungs. I did that twice, but it made no difference. "Anthony, wake up," I screamed, almost as if I was angry at him for dying. I began to panic that his heart had been stopped for too long, and manically began to speed up the CPR. I knew I was acting desperately, but I was desperate. Anthony and I hadn't gotten on when I first met, but we had grown to be friends. He was the only friend I really had, except for Valentine, and suddenly he was dead. I had made a special bond with Anthony. We respected one another, and understood one another. Gemini, stop, I heard Layton say behind me, his hand resting on my shoulder. No, I screamed, shrugging his hands away from me. My entire body was shaking, and I was terrified, but I carried on trying to restart his heart. Tears were blurring my vision, making everything seem hazy and obscure. Gemini, that's enough. I'm sorry, but's he dead? There is nothing we can do, Layton said in my ear, forcefully pulling me away from Anthony. I cried, trying to pull away from his grip. But Layton was incredibly strong, and didn't even flinch as I fought in his arms. Gemini, please, Layton whispered in my ear. He carried me away from Anthony's body and to the car. He took a seat in the passenger's side, and held me on his lap as I sobbed hard. Stop crying, please stop. He sounded as upset as I felt. I looked up into his green eyes, to see them glistening with unshed tears. I had forgotten in my own well of grief that Anthony had been the closest thing that Layton had to a friend. I wrapped my arms around his neck, and held on as tight as possible. He was aiming for me, I choked out, burying my face in his neck. He's dead, Layton replied. If Valentine hadn't have pushed me, I would be dead. He's dead. The bullet was meant for me. He's dead, Layton snapped, his voice harder than before. His grip on me tightened, as I pulled away and we looked into each other's eyes again. Thomas is dead, Gemini. It's all over. But Anthony is dead, I replied, wetting my lips nervously. Thomas may be dead, but so is Anthony. He died in battle like a true soldier, giving himself for his leader. And he will forever be remembered for it. He pressed a soft kiss to my forehead, his lips lingering there for a few seconds. We decided to take Anthony's body back to the Pact, so that he could have a proper burial. We laid his body in the back of the car. Layton drove and I sat on Valentine's lap as we drove home. I curled up in Valentine's hold, trying to stay awake. However, I did end up falling asleep at some point on the drive back, and woke in a terrible nightmare. I screamed and cried and thrashed around. I was lying on the couch in Layton's office as he sat behind his desk. What's wrong? Layton demanded, looking up from his desk. Bad dream, I muttered, sitting up on the couch and running my hands through my loose hair. I glanced down at my clothes, noticing that I had changed. Did you change me? You were covered in blood. I didn't want you to wake up like that, he replied. I was glad and offered him a small smile. What are you doing? What happened to Valentine? What about Anthony? I fired the questions quickly, feeling I had missed so much from just a simple nap. Everything is sorted, Gemini. Valentine left, he said he would call you in the morning to check on you, and Anthony's body is in the hospital. We'll have a funeral soon, Layton told me, his eyes going back to the paperwork in his hand. There were large bags under his eyes, and his frown lines were deep. Walking over to him, I saw he was working on plans for Anthony's funeral. You need to rest, Layton. Why don't you get someone to do this for you? I suggested, worried about how he was handling the death. The person who does this usually is my beta. And in case you've forgotten, my beta fucking died, Layton snapped angrily. I flinched at his hard tone and automatically took a step back. Go home, Gemini, I have lots of work to do. Okay, I whispered, looking away. I knew Layton was lashing out because he was grieving, but it still hurt the way he spoke to me. So I left him alone to deal with the funeral arrangements and walked home. I thought about a lot of things as I stumbled back, mostly about Anthony and Layton. I couldn't get the image out of my head, the bullet hitting Anthony, and him falling to the floor. I thought over the possibility of what would have happened if Valentine had pulled us both out the way. I thought over the possibility of what would have happened if Valentine hadn't pushed me out the way. Both thoughts were as grim as the other. When I got home, I took a shower because I still felt like I was covered in Anthony's blood. Both mentally and physically, he died because of a bullet that was aiming for me, and that made me feel responsible. I knew it was stupid. I kept telling myself that Thomas was to blame, but that didn't ease my whirling mind any. Layton returned later that evening, his face full of tiredness and sadness. If I had only just met Layton, I would have thought he looked emotionless as normal, but I knew him too well. I could see the pain and grief in his eyes. I could see the mask he was holding in place. And even though he'd never admit it, his mask fell away with me. I was sat on the bed and he looked down at me. Sorry, he mumbled, awkwardly rubbing the back of his neck. I was shocked. Layton had never apologized unprompted to me before. I hadn't expected him to give me one, but it was nice to get one. By how uncomfortable he looked, I didn't think he'd ever apologized to anyone before. It's all right, I smiled sadly, as he took a seat next to me. He sat closer than expected, and the bed dipped, throwing me closer into his side. I didn't mind any, and quickly cuddled into him as his arms went around me. Are you tired? He asked me. No, but you must be. Maybe a little, he shrugged. There was a heavy silence that fell over the two of us. We're having the funeral a week today, he broke the silence by saying. We should go to bed. I moved away from Layton, and readied myself for bed. He did the same, neither of us talking as we did so. The tension between us was thick, both of us not wanting to speak about the elephant in the room. The very dead elephant that was our very good friend, whose death we both felt very guilt about. Once in bed, Layton turned the light off and we both just lay there in silence. To my surprise, it was Layton who broke the silence. I don't want to appoint a new beta, he blurted out. I turned over, and we faced each other. It was dark, so I could only see the outline of his face. You can't do all the work by yourself, I sighed sadly, reaching up and cupping his cheek. You'll kill yourself if you do all the work by yourself. But I don't want another one, he frowned. He sounded like a small child in a tantrum, and maybe if the situation were different I would have laughed some. They won't be replacing Anthony. No one can do that. They'll be your new beta. Not your new Anthony, I told Layton. There was a heavy pause, before I hugged him close, Layton burying his face in my neck. I love you, Gemini, he whispered, and for a moment I was frozen in shock. But I didn't get to focus too long on the power of those words, because suddenly Layton began to weep. Chapter 29. The funeral was a sober affair. The rain was falling, the thunder was crackling, and the air was suffocating. I woke up to hear the rain fall hammering against the window. It made me think that the universe was crying for Anthony just as the Pact cried for Anthony. I dressed in a knee-length black dress and a pair of heels. Once my hair was styled, and my makeup was applied, I went down to find Layton having a stiff drink. He glanced up at me before gulping down the liquor. He wore a suit which was black and expensive, but his tie was still undone. You look great, he told me, more because he felt like he needed to, not because he wanted to. He didn't like the black dress because it reminded him of the death, same with my smart hair and black jewelry. You ready to go? I questioned. Layton poured himself another whiskey, downed it quickly before nodding his head. Layton lopped his arm around my waist before we headed out the back door. Layton held the large black umbrella over us as we walked. I love you, I whispered, as his arm dropped from my waist and our fingers intertwined. Ditto, he replied, offering me a sad smile. Even though he'd told me he loved me, the day that Anthony had died, he still had trouble saying it. But I didn't mind, he'd said it once and that was all I cared about. He loved me, he told me so. We walked together in silence as the rain poured around us. The pack was already gathered in the clearing behind the village, and there was an eerie silence that fell over everyone. Everyone was there, men, women, and children. They all wore black and sad expressions. Umbrellas obscured the clearing, as the rain continued to pour. Layton gave my hand a tight squeeze as we walked to the front. Layton spoke loudly, speaking of how gallant and brave Anthony was. He spoke of his kindness, loyalty, and his friendship. He sounded like Layton always did, dominant and loud. Yet I could hear the waver in his voice even if the pack couldn't. Anthony's father and kid brother carried his body in. I was crying soft silent tears as they placed the body on a pile of wood. Layton handed me a large piece of wood before setting light to the top. Anthony's parents and brother also lit their own pieces, as Layton did his. All of us used them to set fire to the pile, the flames wildly growing, the reddish infernos licking the edge of Anthony's body. I choked on a sob as I watched his body being swallowed by the fire. Layton held me to his side as we watched the body turn to ash and the dark smoke fill the rainy sky. There was a haunting feeling to the day, as if the world knew of the death and was mourning our friend with us. It was ridiculously narrow-minded and naive to believe that, but that was how it felt. Like no sunshine would show on that day of grief. For a solid week Layton was quiet and kept to himself more than he usually did. He was grieving, and it was something he needed to work through on his own. Every night he would come home late, before crawling into bed with me. Every night we would make love in silence, before holding each other in silence. The reason that I had always been slightly fearful of Layton even after we'd married and mated was because he was so hard and emotionless. But it was only in those 2 weeks after Antony's death did I finally lose that last bit of fear I had rooted deep in the back of my head. Because I could see that Layton was just as vulnerable as anyone else, and that made him seem more real to me. I had mentally placed Layton on a pedestal, making him seem like a put-together man who knew exactly what he wanted to do, and how he was going to do it. But it was only as I watched him in his sadness and depression that I realized that he was just as young and exposed as me. We were the same but still so different. Exactly a month after Antony's death, Layton called the entire pack to the village. I woke up that morning with plans to have lunch with Arlene, so I was already in the village when he made the announcement. Gemini, he called out to me. As I walked towards the safe, I stopped and waited for him to catch up. Hey, he smiled tightly, pressing a chaste kiss to my lips in greeting. What are you doing here? Calling a pack meeting. What are you doing here? Meeting Arlene for lunch, I replied, taking his hand in mine. His large hand covered my small one and gave it a small squeeze. Can I stand with you? I asked as the pack began to fill the area. Always, he replied, raising our conjoined hands and pressing a kiss to the back of mine. When all the wolves from our pack were there, Layton and I stood near the front. It quickly went silent, as everyone waited for their alpha to speak. Today, Layton's voice boomed after a few moments. I am going to announce our new beta. I knew that it was a big moment for Layton, and I knew he had been dreading it. So it was my turn to squeeze his hand. Instantly, his grip on my hand tightened, showing the significance of the moment. But no one else knew, because on the outside he was their usual blank-faced alpha. No one but me knew the pain he felt in that moment. After the gallant death of our previous beta Antony Randy Strider, I have been watching all our strongest wolves closely. Beta Strider's death was a sad moment for us all. And as my mate reminded me, whoever I appoint will be a new beta, not a new Antony. And I want you all to remember that. I smiled softly to myself, remembering how emotional he had been when I told him that, and I was glad he was telling everyone else the same thing. Layton let a soft moment of stillness fall over the pack before he spoke again. That moment was important. It was him finally saying goodbye to his best friend. So, without further ado, the new beta of the Endoro pack is Layton. Paused once more, Patrick Collins. A soft round of applause filled the pack as the new beta stepped out of the crowd. Patrick was a year or so younger than Layton, with a shaved head and thick eyebrows. He looked intimidating like Layton, but unlike Layton, Patrick had a large goofy smile on his face. He was a true big friendly giant. Layton and Patrick shook hands before Patrick turned to me. Alpha female, I know what Beta Strider did. And one day I hope you'll trust me enough to think of me as someone you can depend on like you did him. Thank you, Patrick, I'm sure you will. I then hugged him. He was surprised but quickly accepted my hug. I knew Layton wouldn't be impressed, and when I felt him tug me back after half a second, I didn't complain. You're all dismissed, Layton told the pack, and they all went their own ways. Patrick, I will meet you back at the offices. Thank you again, Alpha. I'll just grab my computer from home before I catch up with you. He bowed his head before leaving us alone. He seems nice, I smiled up at Layton. He looked like he enjoyed that hug a bit too much, he grumbled under his breath, in a childish way. I rolled my eyes but couldn't help but giggle a bit. I got onto my tiptoes and pressed a soft kiss on his lips. Make sure you come home early tonight, I told him as we stepped apart. But, he began, but I cut him off. No buts, Layton. Be home early. I playfully waggled my finger at him. Layton cocked an eyebrow, looking at me in slight shock. Yes, Alpha female, he chuckled, a small smirk edging onto his lips. I mean it. I really need you home by 6. Alright, I promise. Who is the alpha out of us again? He demanded sarcastically. I giggled again because I was in a good mood before kissing him in goodbye. Once I met Arlene, and she handed me the things I'd asked her to buy me, I headed home. On the walk back, a voice called out to me. I turned to see an unfriendly red head storming towards me. I sighed heavily as Andrea reached me. Gemini, can I have a word? I wasn't sure what came over me, but suddenly a large confident person replaced me. I believe that was 5 words. And you do not address me as Gemini, you address me as Alpha female. Now Andrea, if you are coming to tell me something important, then say it. But if it is something horrible and full of jealousy, then you might as well just leave. There was a heavy moment as Andrea just gawked at me. Leave now before I call my husband, I added. Again, she just stared at me before turning and walking away. Oh, and Andrea, I know you were helping Alpha Roberts and so does Layton. So I would keep a low profile if I were you. Because if you so much as sneeze without our permission, I will make it my mission to have you exiled. So leave me and my husband alone. I couldn't believe that I had finally stood up to Layton's horrible ex-girlfriend. It felt good. No, it felt better that good, it felt amazing. I felt powerful and strong and dominate. Andrea needed to understand that Layton was my husband, and I was her alpha female, and I felt like I had finally gotten that point across. The day was the best one since Anthony had been killed. When it came to 6 o'clock and Layton still wasn't home, I sighed heavily and used the house phone to call his office. However, Patrick answered. Endoro Pac, Beta Collins speaking, he answered. It's Gemini, can you put my forgetful husband on the phone please, I giggled. Patrick chuckled himself, before I heard the sound of movement on the other end. Alpha, the call is for you, Patrick said. Who is it? Layton grumbled, sounding annoyed. Your wife. There was a moment before Layton came on the phone. Shit, I forgot. I'm leaving now, was all he said before he hung up. I laughed softly, as I took a bottle of wine out the fridge and poured Layton a glass for when he arrived. I forgot, sorry, Layton mumbled when he arrived home. I smiled again because I was still not used to him apologizing. He walked into the kitchen, placed a brief kiss on my head, before taking a seat at the table. I served us both some food, before sitting down opposite him. So what is the big deal about tonight? Layton questioned me as we began to eat. I have some news, I smiled softly, slipping my hand over the table to take his. Layton, I'm pregnant again. I grinned brightly as Layton put his fork down and stared at me. I was ecstatic about it because I really wanted a child, but I was also terrified because of losing my last pup. Layton's green eyes stared at me for an entire minute, before he gulped deeply. And you're sure about this? He croaked out. I was pretty sure, but Arlene picked me up a test and I took it this afternoon, I replied. Layton was out of his chair in a second, moving around to take me into his arms. I grinned happily, as I wrapped my arms around his neck and we embraced. Layton and I continued to happily discuss the pup, and how much it was important to keep me safe the second time. We were both nervous about the pregnancy, but we were both happy as well. When we finally went to bed, it was late. Maybe, Layton whispered a few seconds before I was about to go to sleep. If the pup is a boy, we could call him Anthony. Yeah, I yawned, cuddling closer into his embrace. That would be nice. I think Anthony would have really liked that. You should get some sleep now, Gemini. He pressed a soft kiss to the top of my head. You're the best choice I ever made, you know? That day when I chose you, it was honestly the most important day of my life. And I don't regret a thing. I love you, I whispered as my eyes began to close and fatigue took over my body. Ditto, Layton replied. I fell asleep with a happy smile on my lips, and the love of my life in my arms. Bonus chapter. One by one, Layton took off each item of my clothing until I lay naked under him. I was breathing hard, chest rising and falling quickly as Layton studied me. Being wolf meant I spent a lot of time being naked on full moons. So wolves never had an issue with nudity. Yet, under Layton's scrutinizing eyes, I felt more self-aware of my nude body than ever before. So, to move the process along, I began to pull at Layton's shirt, he understood, and began to undress himself. He slipped 2 buttons through the holes before pausing. You take it off, he told me. His voice was rough and hoarse, even more so than normal. I gulped as Layton pulled back so that he was kneeling on the bed. I followed him up, kneeling in front of him. He looked at me, green eyes piercing my body. My hands were shaking as I slowly reached up and took a hold of his shirt. Layton's eyes didn't move off of my face as I undid his shirt. Once it was completely unbuttoned, I glanced at his toned chest and stomach. I reached up and ran my hands down the hard contours, shivering as I did so. I was shocked with how much it made me feel when he'd made me do it. When I first met him, I felt nothing. But then I felt everything. Layton shrugged himself out of the shirt, getting annoyed with how slow everything was going. I wanted it to go slow, but he did know. He was impatient, just like with everything else in his life. He wanted me, and he didn't want to wait any. Taking my hands, he pressed them to his crotch. I squealed slightly at the large bulge that filled my hand. He left my hand there for a split second, before he moved them to his belt. I got the hint and unfastened his suit pants. He moved off the bed, and dropped them before pushing his underwear with them. I blushed the moment he was naked, but there was also a heat that shot through my body. I was both terrified and excited. Desire was coursing through my body at lightning speed, soaking out of every pore, and forcing my heart to pound as fast as it ever had. I glanced over Layton's nude figure, taking in his broad shoulders, patterned tattoos, scars, thick legs, and hard erection. I had seen naked men before at full moons, but none of them had ever been aroused like Layton was right then. He was so turned on that his large member was pressed right up against his stomach, a large vein running through it. I gulped, nervous, but I also felt wetness soaking through my core as I realized exactly what was about to happen. "Lay down," Layton grumbled. Even in the most intimate of situations, he was still a man of little words. I did as he said, my chest heaving out of excitement. Layton admired me for a moment, eyes focusing most only chest and my hips. Finally he moved. He drew me into a heavy kiss, as he hoovered his body over me. I melted into the kiss, my fears flying out of my head, as I wrapped my hands around his neck. His tongue massaged mine, as he pressed his body flush against mine. Taking my hand in his, Layton led it between the two of us and placed it around his erection. I held it loosely for a moment, before gathering some courage, and tightening my grip on it. He growled out softly as I allowed my hand to move up and down his large and hard erection. He liked that, so I picked up pace. Slow, he snapped at me, voice growing hoarser and hoarser as we progressed. "If you go too fast, I may come premature." He kissed my neck as I slowed my hand. His hands moved up to caress my chest, as his teeth nipped at my nape. His callous hands massaged my breast, and had my nipples hardening to an almost painful state. A few minutes later, Layton moved away from me slightly and my hand dropped his erection. He raised slightly, hovering above me. "Are you ready?" he asked. Yes, I nodded, voice raspy and breathy. He nodded at me, smiling softly, but it was almost too harsh because of the intensity in his eyes. Layton moved so he was kneeling in between my legs, and I gulped in anticipation again. He slipped 2 fingers inside me. I hissed in slightly pain as his fingers filled me. Layton frowned before pulling his finger away. "You're not wet enough. The wetter you are, the less it will hurt," he stated. "Will it hurt a lot?" I asked, nervous once more. "I don't know. I'm not a woman," Layton replied simply. "But I'll be able to get inside you easier the more lubrication there is." He moved back slightly before slipped his hands under my thighs. He lifted my legs up so that my hips were raised off the bed. I was confused for a heavy moment before his mouth moved down to my core. I shivered in delight, as his lips practically attached my most intimate area, his stubble tickling the skin. I let out an involuntary moan as his tongue darted out and explored the crevice. His tongue and lips worked my core to the point of quivering, before he pulled away. I made a noise of disappointment as I was too breathless to actually voice any words. "You're ready," was all Layton said. With his hand still under my thighs, he moved closer, still kneeling in between my legs. He slid his erection inside me. He got halfway inside before I cried out in pain. It stung badly. Layton paused for a moment. "It'll hurt the slower I go." "Just do it," I nodded. Layton gave a final push and I hissed in pain. He waited inside me before a moment, as I breathed out. He looked at me, green eyes waiting. I nodded, telling him to continue. For about 5 minutes I was in agony. Every time he pushed in and out of me, my core burnt. But slowly it started to move away from pain and towards pleasure. And soon I was encouraging Layton to go faster. I began to moan and gasp, as the pleasure intensified. But my sounds of delight made Layton get more and more excited, and he began to pick up pace. I love it, wanting the fast friction, but then it became too fast, too rushed. "Layton," I called out, but that just spurred him on more. "That hurts," I shouted at him. He instantly stopped and pulled out of me. He knelt between my legs, both of us breathing hard as his shining eyes stared at my face. "You were going too fast," I explained. Layton calmed himself for a moment, a soft growling vibrating in the back of his throat. He was more animal than human, he'd let his wolf instincts take over. So he took a moment to calm himself, before he lay down over me. He kissed me heavily for a long moment, before he slipped inside me once more. I preferred him making love to me from on top of me. It felt more intimate and meaning. And soon the two of us were climaxing. Don't let the story end. Subscribe to continue our wolf pack legend.